Mention with this, if I ever show you an adjustment and I apply it to my entire picture and the picture looked bad to begin with, I should be making that change in Camera Raw. If I ever do it here, I need to use something to demonstrate how the adjustments work in Photoshop. But if it's the entire image that has an issue and it needs the picture just looks bad, it should be done in Camera Raw. Okay? I only go into Photoshop to do things when it's something either Camera Raw can't do or would be inconvenient to do in Camera Raw. Okay? So let's see what kind of changes we can make, adjustments we can do. What is nice about working in Photoshop is that, I think I'll work on that, is that we don't have the limitations of Camera Raw. Camera Raw has to be able to save all the changes that we make as text attached to the picture. It's called metadata. Photoshop doesn't. When I open something in Photoshop, I'm going to have to save this as a JPEG file, a TIFF file, or a Photoshop file format image, one of those things. And I'm not limited by just saving it as text. And therefore, I'm not limited overall. And so if we go over here to our image menu and we choose adjustments, we got a whole bunch of adjustments. Most of these adjustments duplicate a lot of the things we could do in Camera Raw, but often we'll do it in a slightly different way, where they present you with a different interface. Sometimes that's because we can do things in a much more advanced way here, and other times it's just because it's the old way of doing stuff before Camera Raw existed. And anytime Adobe changes something that's already existing, they get yelled at because somebody's used to using whatever the old thing was. And if you mess with it, they're going to be pissed. They are. If you're used to using something 10 hours a day and suddenly you don't know how to use it, you'd be pissed too, right? So there's a lot of legacy in here, stuff that feels old because it is. But it's still useful and stuff. So let's look at a few of the things we can do. And then the main time I come in here and use this is when I'm not going to apply it to the entire picture. Instead, I'm going to apply it to an isolated area. And that's when it becomes fun, and that's what we'll start doing tomorrow. Okay? So let's take a look. First, brightness and contrast. Simple one, brightness slider. That's a lot like the exposure slider in Camera Raw. Just makes the entire image brighter or darker. If you ever have anybody tell you not to use this, they're used to a really old version of Photoshop. They're an old school Photoshopper. 10 years ago, brightness and contrast was a terrible adjustment. That's why we have this checkbox called Use Legacy. That should say go old school. You know, that means use the old kind. There, it was terrible. It was like you can make an image look terrible regardless of what direction you move this. And when you turn off that, so it's the modern version, it looks fine when you move it this way. It looks fine when you move it that way. You know, it's, so if you ever hear anybody say that, it's usually them used to an old version. They never noticed that they changed this. But brightness and contrast is very similar to the exposure and contrast sliders we have in Camera Raw, so I'm not going to spend too much time with it. Other adjustments that we have in here that are useful are levels. You see a bar chart. That's similar to the bar chart we see in Camera Raw. It tells you the same information where black is on the left, white is on the right. So this tells me that we have a good amount of white in this image. See how that tall that is? And allows us to do various things with it. This, though, is this slider here is like the black slider in Camera Raw. This slider here is like the white slider in Camera Raw. But we have them in Camera Raw, so we don't really need to do it here. So it'd be useful to have that, but boy, it's much more useful to have this combined with the previous adjustment we had called brightness contrast, where they're just sitting right above each other. It's such a more efficient way of working. In here, we're also going to find other adjustments. One is called Hue and Saturation, which is quite nice. And with Hue and Saturation, what we can do is we can tell it to work on a particular color from this menu. Let's say we want to work only on the areas in this picture that are blue. So we choose blues. And then we can adjust one of these three things about it. We can adjust the lightness and brighten up the blues or darken the blues. And it doesn't affect the other colors in the image. Or we can make the blues more colorful or make the blues less colorful, even go black and white. Or we can change the hue. Hue is just a fancy word. It just means what color something is. So if I change the hue of blue, it means it will no longer be blue. It will be green or blue or yellow, or I said blue in there, or other colors. We can shift it around. You might think, well, that's cool. Well, that's in Camera Raw. We just didn't get to that tab. If you want to see how that's done in Camera Raw, I'll just open an image in Camera Raw. Remember all these little tabs that are over here? Well, there's this one right here. That's called the HSL tab. And in here we can adjust the luminance, which means the brightness, of all these colors. These are the same colors that you would find under the pop-up menu that was in Hue and Saturation in Photoshop, where I told it to work on the blues. Here it just gives me a bunch of sliders. And I come over here and say, let's make the blues darker. Let's make the greens brighter. Maybe the yellows brighter. I can go to saturation and say, let's make the blues less colorful, maybe black and white. You know, it's the same kind of thing in here. It's just a slightly different interface. It's actually a better interface because I don't have to go to a pop-up menu to see what color I'm working on. So anyway, we have a similar functionality, but the one in Photoshop can actually go further, and we'll see that when we get a little bit deeper into it. So with these adjustments, it's going to be a lot of repetition between this and Camera Raw, but using a different interface. Old interface with these, more modern with Camera Raw. And it's a matter of deciding when is it worth going to these. The main time it's worth it is when you use something known as an adjustment layer. An adjustment layer will allow you to work on isolated areas of your picture. You'll be able to do it very precisely, and you'll be able to apply any of those particular adjustments. And we're going to get into adjustment layers tomorrow. For now, let me open an image that has some, and I'll give you an idea of what they're capable of. This image has had a bunch of adjustments done. And if I turn them off in my layers panel and just show you the bottom layer, that's our original picture. Then above the original picture, we have a bunch of changes on top of it. The first layer, and we'll talk about layers tomorrow, is actually a retouching layer. It's just getting rid of a small speck near the bottom of the picture. You see just below the shadow of the log, there's a little speck, and its removal is in this layer. Then we have a bunch of adjustment layers. This one here, if I turn it on by turning on its eyeball, is adding contrast to the water. Not the whole picture, just the water at the bottom. Then we have another one that's enhancing just the log. Then we got another one that's enhancing just the sky. And these are just built up, one on top of another, making changes to build up this image and produce its end result. But unlike in Camera Raw, we're not limited in the way these are applied. With Camera Raw, the adjustment brush is overly limited in how you can apply it. Getting it to wrap tightly around tree branches, for instance, not the easiest thing to do. It's not that it's easy in Photoshop, but it's possible. It's more workable, more versatile. But this is going to start looking a little bit more complicated. These are layers, though. We're going to get into layers in depth tomorrow. The main thing you need to know is in the case of adjustment layers or anything else, it's always as if you're standing at the top of that stack of things that are shown in the layers palette and you're looking down. And whatever's on top is doing something to your view of what's below it. If it's an adjustment layer, it's like a pair of sunglasses. It's changing how bright or something else is about what's underneath. If, on the other hand, it's a layer that contains a picture, it's obscuring your view of anything that's below that. Just like a piece of paper here. It can obscure my view of my keyboard if it's sitting on top of it. Yeah, but it's always as if you're standing at the top looking down. So tomorrow what we're going to do is we're going to start working with layers, and we're going to start creating all sorts of things. You'll learn how, if you want to create little promos, imagine that the gray bar that's in here had a picture in it, where you're creating a just married promo, or a layout like this where each one of those squares would be a different photo, another just married one where you'd have different images, this kind of stuff. We can easily do this, put text on our images. We can't do that in Camera Raw. We can't do that in Lightroom. We need Photoshop for that. You want to put a picture in that kind of frame? Can't do it in Lightroom. Can't do it in Camera Raw. And so we'll start getting into that kind of stuff. And it all has to do with learning layers.